Divorce this woman or you'll never see a penny of my fortune. My father-in-law roared across the mahogany dining table. The crystal chandelier above us trembled with his rage. My husband Preston sat frozen beside me, his hand that had been holding mine suddenly pulling away. That momentary hesitation pierced deeper than any knife could. 3 years of marriage, of building dreams together, and he actually paused to consider his options. I felt the weight of the silver locket against my chest. With steady hands that betrayed none of my heartbreak, I reached for the thin chain around my neck. Before anyone makes decisions they'll regret, I said softly, there's something you should see. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. I'm curious because this story about family secrets spans generations and crosses borders. I wonder if where you're from shapes how you'll judge what I did. And stick around until the end to rate my revenge on a scale from 1 to 10. Let's begin. My name is Eliana Westerly. I grew up in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except mine. I was the girl with no past, raised by a single mother who died too young and left behind more questions than answers. I put myself through nursing school with scholarships and 3 part-time jobs, developing a reputation for being fiercely independent and painfully private. My colleagues called me steel-spined Eliana for my ability to remain composed in even the most chaotic emergency room situations. That composure served me well when I met Preston Harrington at a charity auction 3 years ago. I was there representing a rural medical outreach program where I volunteered on weekends. Preston attended because his father, Bartholomew Harrington, real estate tycoon and self-proclaimed kingmaker, quote, was the event's primary donor. Preston wasn't what I expected from the son of a notorious businessman. He spoke passionately about sustainable architecture and water purification systems for developing countries. When he asked for my number, I nearly declined. Men with trust funds had never been my type. I'm not my father, he'd said, as if reading my thoughts. Give me 1 coffee to prove it. 1 coffee became dinner. Dinner became weekend hikes. Within 6 months, Preston had introduced me to his vision for bringing affordable water systems to underserved communities, and I'd fallen deeply in love with his gentle determination. The first time I met Bartholomew was at Preston's birthday dinner. He studied me like I was a specimen under glass, asking pointed questions about my people and my background. When I explained I'd been raised by a single mother who passed away from cancer when I was 19, leaving me essentially alone in the world, something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy, calculation. No aunts, uncles, not even distant cousins, he pressed. Just me, I answered. My mother never spoke about her family. How convenient, he muttered, lifting his wine glass. Preston proposed 3 months later, despite his father's obvious disapproval. We had a small ceremony at a botanical garden with only 30 guests. Bartholomew attended but remained stone-faced throughout, leaving immediately after the required photographs. He'll come around, Preston assured me as we drove to our honeymoon. He just needs time to see what I see in you. But Bartholomew Harrington had no intention of coming around. While Preston worked at his father's company, developing a division focused on environmental sustainability, I continued my nursing career and volunteer work. Our lives were busy but fulfilling. For the first year, we managed to minimize contact with Bartholomew to obligatory holiday gatherings and the occasional business dinner. Everything changed after our first anniversary. Bartholomew began appearing unannounced at our home, suggesting impromptu father-son outings that pointedly excluded me. Business trips that Preston needed to take mysteriously extended whenever I planned to accompany him. Whispered conversations between father and son would abruptly cease when I entered a room. It's nothing, Preston would insist when I questioned him. Just business stuff you'd find boring. Then came the manila envelope delivered to our doorstep addressed to Preston with no return address. Inside was what appeared to be a background check on me, grainy photographs of the various foster homes I'd briefly stayed in after my mother's death, before I'd aged out of the system. Financial records highlighting the scholarships I'd received. The implications were clear. I couldn't be trusted. I was after the Harrington money. Preston defended me, burning the documents in our fireplace while promising his father's paranoia would never come between us. But I saw the seed of doubt that had been planted. The way his eyes sometimes followed me when I checked our joint account or when I mentioned the future. Do you think I married you for money? I finally asked him one night. Of course not. He answered too quickly. Then why do you look at me differently now? Preston sighed, running his hands through his hair. It's not you, Eliana. It's him. He gets in my head, makes me question everything, even things I know to be true. Like your love for me? No, he said firmly, pulling me close. Never that. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But something had shifted between us. A hairline fracture in our foundation. 2 months ago, I discovered why Bartholomew's campaign against me had intensified. I overheard a phone conversation between Preston and his best friend, Theo. The board of directors had quietly named Preston as successor to the company. The something Bartholomew had never intended. They recognized Preston's innovation and integrity, qualities that were bringing in a new generation of clients concerned with sustainability. Preston's vision threatened his father's outdated business model built on exploitation and corner cutting. That night, I made a decision. I would investigate Bartholomew Harrington's past. If he wanted to dig into my background, I would return the favor. I spent late nights researching, visiting county records offices, connecting with former employees who'd been discarded after decades of service. What I discovered was both painful and illuminating. Bartholomew hadn't always been Bartholomew Harrington, real estate tycoon. 50 years ago, he'd been Bart Harrison, a college sophomore from a middle-class family, dating a bright-eyed freshman named Lydia. When Lydia became pregnant, Bart vanished, transferring to a different university and changing his name to distance himself from responsibility. He reinvented himself completely, built his empire, and started a new family, never acknowledging his firstborn child. That child was my mother. I found the evidence in a small-town newspaper archive, a birth announcement with Lydia's name but no father listed, dated exactly 9 months after the last photograph of young Bart and Lydia together at a campus event. Then I found Lydia's death certificate from 5 years later, a car accident that left her daughter orphaned. That daughter, adopted by distant relatives who gave her their last name, grew up to become my mother. The final piece fell into place when I tracked down my mother's adoption records and found a single photograph slipped between the pages. A young woman holding an infant, standing beside a young man whose face I'd come to know from the portraits hanging in Bartholomew's mansion. On the back in faded ink, Lydia, Bart, and baby Grace. My mother, my grandfather, me. The confrontation came during our monthly family dinner at Bartholomew's estate. I'd worn the silver locket that had belonged to my mother, the only piece of jewelry she'd owned that she never sold, even in our hardest times. Inside, I'd carefully preserved the photograph I'd discovered. I watched Bartholomew throughout dinner, this man who had spent 3 years trying to remove me from his son's life, never knowing I was the only connection to his firstborn child. The irony was almost too much to bear. When he finally delivered his ultimatum, my husband's inheritance or me, I was ready. His face drained of color as he stared at the tiny photograph in my locket. He swayed, clutching the edge of the table before collapsing back into his chair. I never knew until 2 weeks ago. I whispered into the silence. My mother died never knowing her father's identity. Preston looked between us, confusion giving way to understanding. Father, he said slowly. What is this? Bartholomew couldn't speak. The empire of lies he'd built was crumbling with a single image. Your father abandoned his pregnant girlfriend 50 years ago, I explained to Preston. He changed his name, his history, everything, to start fresh without responsibility. That baby was my mother. I'm not just your wife. I'm his granddaughter. Preston stared at his father, his expression shifting from shock to disgust. You've been trying to remove your own granddaughter from the family? The old man's hands trembled as he reached for the photograph. How did you? He began, but couldn't finish. I did what you did to me, I said evenly. I investigated. The difference is, I found the truth, not fabrications. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence that followed. 3 generations of secrets laid bare on a dining table worth more than my childhood home. You wanted to know who my people were, I continued. Well, now you know, they're you. Preston stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. All these years? He said to his father. All your talk about legacy and bloodlines and family honor? Was it all just to cover this up? To hide the fact that you abandoned your own child? The question hung in the air like smoke. I watched the mighty Bartholomew Harrington, The man who'd terrorized boardrooms and broken business rivals. Struggle for words. It was a different time, he finally managed. I was young, scared. So was my mother, I cut in. So was I. Preston turned to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Did you know? When we met, when we married, did you know who I was? Who he was? This was the moment I dreaded. The question that could destroy everything. No, I answered truthfully. I had no idea. My mother never spoke of her father. She didn't know herself. She was adopted after her mother died. I only discovered this when I started digging into your father's past. After he tried to dig into mine. Preston nodded slowly, processing. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, reassessing everything he thought he knew about his family. About me. What do you want? Bartholomew finally asked, his voice hoarse. Money? Position? Your name on the company? I looked at this broken man, my grandfather, and felt something unexpected. Pity. I didn't come for your fortune or your approval, I said, removing the locket and placing it on the table. But I won't let you separate me from my husband, your son, and my family, the only family I have left. The truth echoed through the grand dining room. 3 people bound by blood and betrayal, staring at a tiny photograph that changed everything. What happened next would determine whether the Harrington legacy would crumble or transform, whether 3 years of marriage could withstand the weight of 50 years of secrets, whether some wounds were too deep to heal, or if blood truly was thicker than water. Preston reached for my hand across the table. This time, there was no hesitation. We should go, he said quietly. Preston, Bartholomew called as we stood. Don't walk away from everything I've built for you. My husband turned to his father, jaw set. You've built an empire on lies. I'm not sure I want any part of it. As we moved toward the door, Bartholomew rose shakily to his feet. Wait, he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. Please, I need to know about her, about Grace. I paused at the threshold, looking back at this powerful man suddenly reduced to begging. Why? You had 50 years to find out and never bothered. I was a coward, he admitted, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. The biggest mistake of my life was walking away from Lydia. I've lived with that shame every day. Not enough shame to acknowledge her or your daughter, I pointed out. No, he agreed, not enough. He gestured to the chair I'd vacated. Please, just tell me about Grace. Was she happy? Did she have a good life? The question pierced through my anger. My mother's life had been a struggle. Working multiple jobs to support us. Battling cancer without family support. Dying too young and alone except for me. But there had also been joy, laughter, fierce love, and determination that shaped who I became. Parts of her life were beautiful, I said carefully. Parts were unbearably hard. She was the strongest person I've ever known. Something shifted in Bartholomew's eyes. Grief, perhaps. Or recognition. Like you, he whispered. I didn't answer. The compliment, if that's what it was, felt hollow after years of his attempts to drive me away. Preston squeezed my hand. We need time, he told his father. This changes everything. As we walked to our car, Preston was silent, processing the revelation. Finally, as we pulled away from the estate, he asked, What do you want to do now? It was the question I'd been asking myself since discovering the truth. Did I want revenge? Compensation? Public acknowledgement? None of those felt right. I want what I've always wanted, I answered. A family that chooses each other. Even when it's difficult. Even when the past is complicated. Preston nodded, deep in thought. And my father? Do you want him in that family? That depends, I said, watching the mansion recede in the side mirror. On whether he can finally take responsibility for the choices he made. On whether he can see me as more than a threat to his perfect legacy. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The legacy Bartholomew had so fiercely protected would continue through me, the bloodline he'd rejected and tried to erase. The person he'd spent years trying to drive away was the only connection to his firstborn child. But revenge wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was far more complicated. As we drove home in silence, the weight of revelation hung between us. Preston white-knuckled the steering wheel, his profile sharp against the gathering darkness. I wondered if he was seeing me differently now, not just as his wife, but as an unexpected branch of his family tree. A complication in the Harrington dynasty. Did you ever suspect? He finally asked, his voice barely audible over the engine's hum. Before you started investigating, did you ever feel connected to my father somehow? I thought about the first time I'd walked into Bartholomew's mansion, the strange sensation of déjà vu I'd dismissed. How I'd paused at a painting in the hall, a seascape that had inexplicably brought tears to my eyes. There were moments, I admitted, nothing I could explain, just echoes. Preston nodded slowly. When you showed that photograph, I saw it immediately. You have his eyes. The observation startled me. I'd spent hours studying that picture, noting my mother's smile, her chin reflected in my own face, but I deliberately avoided seeing myself in Bartholomew. Does that bother you? I asked carefully. Preston pulled the car to the side of the road and turned to face me fully. What bothers me is that he tried to take you away from me, not knowing who you really were. What bothers me is that I let him plant doubts. His voice broke. I hesitated today, Eliana. When he gave me that ultimatum, I actually hesitated. I know, I said, the pain of that moment still fresh. Can you forgive me for that? I studied my husband's face, the genuine remorse etched across his features, the fear of losing me evident in his eyes. I understand the power he has over you. I've watched it for 3 years. That's not an answer. I know that too. I reached for his hand. I need time, Preston. This changes everything for me as well. He nodded, accepting this truth. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, both lost in private reckonings with the past and uncertain futures. The next morning, Preston called in sick to work for the first time in his career. We sat at our kitchen table with mugs of untouched coffee between us. I found more than just that photograph, I told him, retrieving a folder from my office. There's something you should see. Inside were documents I'd compiled during my investigation, old newspaper clippings, university records, and most damning, correspondence between young Bartholomew and his parents discussing the Lydia situation and their plans to handle it quietly. Preston read through everything methodically, his expression darkening with each page. He knew, he whispered. He always knew about your mother. Yes, I confirmed. And there's more. I showed him the trust fund documentation I'd uncovered, established in my mother's name but never activated, money set aside by Bartholomew's parents that he'd taken control of after their deaths. Money that should have supported my mother through her childhood, her education, her cancer treatments, money that instead had been folded into Bartholomew's growing empire. He stole from his own daughter, Preston said, his voice hollow with disbelief. The same daughter whose hospital bills I'm still paying off 10 years after her death. I added quietly. Preston pushed away from the table, pacing our kitchen with restless energy. We need to confront him with this. Take legal action. That money is rightfully yours. And then what? Drag this through the courts? Watch your family name become a tabloid sensation? Business titan abandons pregnant girlfriend? Defrauds daughter? Is that what you want? I want justice for you. For your mother. I stood, moving to block his pacing. This isn't just about justice, Preston. It's about who we choose to be in response to cruelty. Your father abandoned his responsibilities. He lied, manipulated, and stole. If we respond with public humiliation and legal battles, how are we any different? This isn't the same thing, he protested. Isn't it, causing pain to protect ourselves? Preston fell silent, considering my words. After a long moment, he asked, Then what do you propose? I want to meet with him. Alone. Absolutely not, Preston said immediately. After everything he's done, precisely because of everything he's done, I interrupted. This is between me and him now. Granddaughter and grandfather. He could try to manipulate you, offer you money to disappear. I've spent my entire life fighting harder battles than Bartholomew Harrington. I reminded him. Trust me to handle this one. Preston studied my face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there must have reassured him, because he finally nodded. When? Today. Before he has time to build his defenses back up. 3 hours later, I stood at the gates of Bartholomew's estate, alone. The security guard recognized me from the previous night's dinner and waved me through with a curious glance. As I approached the massive front doors, They opened before I could knock. Bartholomew stood in the entryway, looking years older than he had just hours ago. "I've been expecting you," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. He led me to his study, a room I'd never been invited into before. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the space. He gestured to a seating area by the window, where tea had been arranged on a small table. "You knew I would come," I observed, taking a seat opposite him. "I hoped you would." He poured tea with shaking hands. "Though I wasn't certain you'd come alone." This conversation needed to happen without Preston as a buffer. Bartholomew nodded, setting down his cup untouched. "I spent the night looking at old photographs. Things I've kept hidden for decades." He indicated a small stack of albums on the side table. "Would you like to see your grandmother?" The question caught me off guard. In all my investigation, I'd found only that one photograph of Lydia. The idea of seeing more of her, the woman whose face my mother had searched for in crowds her entire life, was overwhelming. "Yes," I said simply. Bartholomew opened the top album. Inside were dozens of photographs of a young woman with laughing eyes and long dark hair. Lydia at the beach. Lydia on campus. Lydia looking at the camera with unmistakable love. "She wanted to be a doctor," Bartholomew said softly. "Brilliant mind. Determined. Everyone said she was too idealistic, wanting to open clinics in underserved areas." He glanced up at me. "Your mother followed that path, becoming a nurse. And you as well." "How do you know that?" I asked sharply. "I've known who you were since the day Preston brought you home," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "Not at first," he clarified quickly. "But that night you mentioned your mother's name, Grace. You said she'd been raised by distant relatives after her mother died in a car accident." I knew immediately. My mind raced, recalibrating every interaction we'd had over the past 3 years. "You knew I was your granddaughter, and still tried to drive me away from your son? Your own blood?" Bartholomew couldn't meet my eyes. I told myself it was impossible. A coincidence. I hired investigators to disprove it. But they confirmed it instead. I guessed. He nodded miserably. 6 months after you married Preston. By then, I'd already begun my campaign against you. And you couldn't stop because that would mean admitting the truth, I finished for him. Admitting who you really are, what you did. "I was a coward 50 years ago," he said. "I've remained one ever since." I stood abruptly, needing distance from this man who had caused so much pain. "You let me believe I was alone in the world. You watched me struggle with medical debt from my mother's illness. You tried to convince your son I was a gold digger when you knew I was family." "I've made inexcusable choices," he acknowledged. "Choices?" I laughed bitterly. "A choice is what tie to wear. What you did was systematic cruelty, spanning decades." Bartholomew rose as well, moving to his desk. He unlocked a drawer and removed a thick folder. "I can't change the past," he said, "but perhaps I can begin to address the present." He handed me the folder. Inside were financial documents. The trust fund meant for my mother. Untouched for decades. Now worth millions. There were also property deeds, stock certificates, and a letter formally acknowledging me as his granddaughter and heir. "What is this?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "Everything that should have been your mother's. Everything that should have been yours all along." He watched me anxiously. "It's yours, regardless of what happens between you and Preston. Regardless of whether you ever forgive me." I closed the folder slowly, processing what this meant. Financial security I'd never known. The acknowledgement my mother had died without receiving. A grandfather claiming responsibility half a century too late. "Do you think this makes it right?" I asked quietly. "No," he answered honestly. "Nothing could. But it's a beginning." I placed the folder on his desk, watching confusion cross his face. "I didn't come for money." "Then why did you come?" It was the same question Preston had asked. The same question I'd been asking myself since discovering the truth. "I came to understand who I am," I said finally. "I've spent my life feeling disconnected, like I was missing pieces of my own story. Now I know why." Bartholomew nodded slowly. "And do you understand now?" "I'm beginning to." I moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. The dinner last night. The ultimatum. Was that genuine? Or was it a test? The old man sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. Both? He admitted. I wanted to see if Preston would choose the fortune over you. And I wanted to force your hand to see if you would finally reveal what you knew. You gambled with your son's happiness to avoid taking responsibility, I observed. As I said, I remain a coward. At the door, I turned back one last time. I'll consider your offer. But know this, I won't be bought off or silenced. Whatever happens next will be on my terms, not yours. As I drove away from the estate, my phone rang. Preston. How did it go? He asked anxiously. He knew, I said, the words still bitter on my tongue. He's known who I was since shortly after we married. Preston's sharp intake of breath carried through the speaker. That's impossible. He wouldn't have. He confirmed it himself. I cut him off. And there's more. He offered me everything. The trust fund meant for my mother, properties, stocks, my inheritance as his granddaughter. Did you take it? Not yet, I answered truthfully. I need to think. About what? It's rightfully yours, Eliana. I pulled into a scenic overlook, needing a moment to gather my thoughts. Below, the city sprawled. Somewhere down there was our modest home, the life we'd built together, believing ourselves to be starting from scratch. It's not that simple, I explained. If I accept, it means acknowledging him as family. It means letting him think money can solve 50 years of abandonment and 3 years of psychological warfare against us. Then don't accept it, Preston said simply. If I don't, I'm choosing pride over practicality. That money could fund rural clinics like my mother dreamed of building. It could pay for other daughters to get the medical care my mother couldn't afford. Preston was quiet for a long moment. You've already decided, haven't you? I watched a hawk circling above the valley, riding thermals with effortless grace. I think I have. But I need your support. Whatever you decide, I'm with you, he promised. No hesitation this time, no doubts. That evening, we sat together on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. I'd made my decision about Bartholomew's offer, but something else weighed on me. There's something I haven't told you, I said, breaking our comfortable silence. Something I found during my investigation. Preston set down his glass, giving me his full attention. What is it? Your father didn't just abandon my mother and grandmother. I began carefully. He systematically removed anyone who threatened to expose his past. Former classmates who remembered Lydia. Old neighbors who might recognize him from news coverage as his wealth grew. Removed how? Preston asked, his voice tight. Payoffs mostly. Threats occasionally. I hesitated before delivering the final revelation. And when your mother began asking questions about his past, about why there were no photographs of him before college graduation, why his parents never mentioned his childhood, he divorced her. The official story was that she'd had an affair. Preston stood abruptly. My mother never cheated on him. She told me that on her deathbed, begged me to believe her. She was telling the truth. I confirmed. I found the private investigator's report your father commissioned. He was looking for evidence of an affair but found none. He fabricated it to justify the divorce when she got too close to his secrets. How could you keep this from me? Preston demanded, anger flashing in his eyes. I only confirmed it yesterday, I said softly. And then everything happened at dinner. Preston paced the length of our small porch, processing this new betrayal. He destroyed my relationship with my mother, made me believe she'd betrayed our family. I barely spoke to her the last 5 years of her life because of his lies. The pain in his voice broke my heart. For all Bartholomew had taken from me, a grandmother, financial security, a mother who died too young from inadequate medical care, he had stolen something equally precious from his son. Trust in the mother who had loved him unconditionally. I'm sorry, I whispered, knowing the words were inadequate. Preston stopped pacing, his decision visibly crystallizing. We need to make him pay. Not just for what he did to your family, but for what he did to mine. To us. I stood, taking his hands in mine. That's exactly what I've been planning. What do you mean? I led him inside to my office, where a whiteboard was covered with notes, timelines, and strategies, the results of weeks of careful planning. Revenge isn't about hurting him back, I explained. It's about justice, for your mother, for mine, for Lydia. It's about truth. Preston studied my work, understanding dawning in his eyes. The company anniversary gala next week, he said slowly. Every board member, major investor, and business partner will be there. I nodded. The perfect audience for the truth. He'll never recover professionally, Preston warned. The company could collapse. Not if you're ready to take the reins, I countered. Not if we show there's a new Harrington vision, one built on integrity and accountability, not secrets and exploitation. Preston looked at me with new appreciation. You've thought of everything. Not revenge, I corrected him. Redemption, for the Harrington name, for your mother's reputation, for my mother's dreams. My husband pulled me close. When did you become so strategic? I smiled against his shoulder. I've always been strategic. How do you think a foster kid with no connections put herself through nursing school and landed a husband like you? For the first time since the revelation at dinner, Preston laughed. So what's the plan exactly? I pointed to the center of my whiteboard, where a single phrase was circled. The Grace Foundation. We're going to announce a new Harrington initiative, I explained. Named after my mother. Dedicated to supporting single mothers and their children with healthcare, education, and housing. Using Bartholomew's money? Preston added, catching on quickly. The money he offered me, the money that should have been my mother's, will seed the foundation. I confirmed. But here's the key. We don't expose him publicly as the villain. We position him as the repentant grandfather. Finally making amends. Why protect him after everything he's done? Preston asked, bewildered. Because public humiliation would be temporary. This way, he's trapped by his own redemption story. Every board meeting, every gala, every press interview for the rest of his life, he'll have to pretend to be the man who's making amends, who acknowledges his mistakes and is working to repair them. And if he refuses to play along, then we have the documentation to destroy him, I said simply. But I don't think he will. His reputation means too much. He'll accept the role we've created for him because the alternative is worse. Preston shook his head in amazement. This isn't revenge, it's justice, I finished for him, long overdue justice. As we finalized our plans for the gala, Preston asked the question that had been hanging between us. After all this is over, can we ever be a normal family? Can you ever see him as your grandfather, not just the man who abandoned your mother? I considered this carefully. I don't know, I answered honestly. But I'm willing to find out. Family isn't just about blood, it's about choices. He made terrible ones. Now he has the chance to make better ones. The night of the gala arrived with breathtaking speed. I stood before our bedroom mirror in a simple blue gown, fastening my mother's silver locket around my neck. Inside, I'd replaced the damning photograph with something new, a picture of my mother holding me as a baby, smiling with the fierce love that had defined our small family. Preston appeared behind me, handsome in his tuxedo. Ready to change everything? He asked, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I've been ready my whole life, I answered. The ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel glittered with wealth and influence. Bartholomew stood near the entrance, greeting guests with practiced charm. When he saw us, his smile faltered momentarily before he composed himself. Preston. Eliana. He nodded stiffly. I wasn't certain you would come. We wouldn't miss it, Preston replied, his voice cool but controlled. After all, family should stick together for important occasions. Bartholomew's eyes darted nervously between us. Have you considered my offer? He asked me quietly. I have, I said. And I've decided to accept with conditions. Relief washed over his face. Name them. Not here, Preston interjected. During your speech. Alarm replaced relief. My speech? That's hardly the appropriate time for... It's exactly the right time, I cut in. Trust me, you'll want to hear what we have planned. Throughout dinner, Bartholomew kept glancing our way, clearly unsettled by the cryptic exchange. When the time came for his address, he approached the podium with visible trepidation. Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, he began, his voice betraying none of his anxiety. 50 years ago, I founded this company with nothing but determination and a vision. As he continued his rehearsed remarks about legacy and family values, Preston squeezed my hand under the table. We'd given Bartholomew's assistant a sealed envelope earlier, with strict instructions to deliver it to him at precisely this moment in his speech. Right on cue, the assistant appeared at the side of the stage, handing Bartholomew the envelope. He paused, clearly annoyed at the interruption, but opened it nonetheless. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences. Announce the Grace Foundation. Follow the teleprompter. Bartholomew looked up, confused, until he noticed the teleprompter at the back of the room had changed from his prepared remarks to new text. His eyes widened as he read what we'd written. For a breathless moment, I thought he might refuse, might crumple the paper and continue with his original speech. Instead, he cleared his throat and began reading our words. Tonight marks not just a celebration of the past, but a commitment to a better future. I am proud to announce the establishment of the Grace Foundation, named after my first daughter, dedicated to supporting single mothers and their children with healthcare, education, and housing. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. First daughter? No one had ever heard Bartholomew mention a daughter besides Preston's sister. This foundation, he continued, his voice growing steadier, represents my commitment to making amends for past mistakes and ensuring no child or mother faces the struggles that Grace and her daughter Eliana experienced. Heads turned in my direction, connections being made. Bartholomew pressed on, following our script perfectly. The foundation will be headed by my granddaughter, Eliana Westerly, and supported by my son Preston, who will be taking a more active leadership role in the company moving forward. By now, the ballroom was buzzing with whispers. Bartholomew looked directly at me as he delivered the final lines. Family is our greatest legacy. Not buildings, not wealth, but the lives we touch and the wrongs we right. The Grace Foundation begins with a personal contribution of $50 million, the trust fund that should have supported Grace throughout her life, with interest. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing as people rose to their feet. Not for Bartholomew, but for the foundation, for the apparent gesture of reconciliation and responsibility. I remained seated, watching the man who had denied my existence for decades now claim me publicly as family. The revenge wasn't in hurting him or humiliating him. It was in forcing him to become the man he should have been all along, a man who acknowledged his mistakes and worked to repair them. As Bartholomew stepped down from the podium, cameras flashed. The press would have a field day with this unexpected revelation. His carefully constructed image as a self-made man was forever altered. Not destroyed, but transformed into something more complex, more human. He made his way to our table, face unreadable. When he reached us, he extended his hand, not to Preston first as protocol would dictate, but to me. Well played, he said quietly, for my ears only. I took his hand, feeling the tremor in his grip. This isn't a game, I replied. It's a beginning. For a moment, something genuine flickered across his face. Perhaps respect, perhaps fear, perhaps a glimmer of the grandfather he might have been in another life. To beginnings, then, he said, raising his voice for the benefit of those watching. And to family. Preston stood, placing his arm protectively around my waist. To family? He echoed, the word carrying layers of meaning only the three of us fully understood. As we posed for photographs, the mighty Bartholomew Harrington, his son and heir Preston, and the newly revealed granddaughter Eliana, I felt the weight of my mother's locket against my chest. Inside was her image, bearing witness to this moment of reckoning and reconciliation. The revenge wasn't in destroying Bartholomew Harrington. It was in becoming undeniably part of his legacy. The part he couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't deny any longer. I had entered his world as an outsider he tried to expel. I would remain in it as the keeper of his greatest secret and the guardian of his lasting reputation. Every donation to the Grace Foundation, every life changed through its work, would be both his penance and my triumph. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Bartholomew approached me one last time, away from the crowd. You could have destroyed me, he said, searching my face. Why didn't you? I touched the locket at my throat, thinking of my mother, of all she had taught me about strength and forgiveness. Because destruction is easy, I answered. Redemption is harder. And I wanted you to do the hard thing for once in your life. If you've made it to the end of my story, I'd love to know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate my revenge? Was forcing my grandfather to become a better man more satisfying than destroying him would have been? Drop your rating in the comments and let me know what you would have done in my position. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about making someone suffer, but about making them change. And sometimes, just sometimes, that change can heal wounds that span generations.